All right, we are live. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. This is our second event of the 2025 season of the Executive Roundtable for Materials Growth. I'm Kendall Justiniano. I'm the host for today's event, and I'm Managing Director of Growth Arc Advisors. The Roundtable is a network of executives from the materials industries who are focused on growth and how to achieve it. Our mission is to provide a forum to discuss issues and approaches vital to a thriving materials industry. If you're here, it means you have executive level membership. So we will follow up by sending you links for a video replay as well as an executive summary, and you will also get access to any of the slides that we showed today. Without further ado, if you have your view set to speaker mode, you should be able to see today's guest, Dr. Bob Johnson, and myself on your screens. Dr. Johnson is the founder and managing partner at Shoreline Partners, and he has a track record of guiding over 1,000 CEOs, executives, and their teams. And with that, he equips those clients with the awareness and skills to turn their recurring problems into partnerships that drive performance and that build cultures where people have one another's backs. Even the most capable leaders unknowingly sometimes sabotage learning while believing they're committed to it. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that happens today. Prior to his work in the corporate sector, Dr. Johnson served as a division psychologist with the 1st Infantry Division, United States Army. And during his 5 years of active duty service, he completed assignments in Germany, Iraq, Kuwait, and in the US. I wanted to get Bob on the roundtable today because I myself have seen and experienced the type of conflicts that he helps deal with. In fact, sometimes the kind of conflict can become so normal that we become resigned to it. Given the tough times the materials industry is going through these days, executives are running their teams leaner than ever, and that makes the context ripe for such type of conflict. So getting them to run effectively can be a force multiplier. I think Dr. Bob's got some really interesting perspectives today, and I can't wait to get into the conversation. So welcome, Dr. Bob Johnson.
All right, Kendall. Hey, great to be with you and be with the audience here today.
Fantastic. I guess first off, can you give us a sense of your personal story? What's your career arc, and how did you end up responsible for something like team transformation in the corporate sector?
Right. Couldn't I have picked an easier job? Uh, so, I'm a psychologist by training. I'm actually a clinical guy. I trained as a child psychologist, and as I like to say, that skill set comes in handy in my work with every leadership team. My child psychology background, but it was after grad school I joined the Army, and
Mhm.
it was through that time, particularly during my time in Germany, where I started to do a lot of work with company commanders around the connection between leadership and unit well-being and so on. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. So when I got out in '05, I made the shift to organizational consulting,
Mhm.
and I've been doing that for the last 20 years. I can't believe that's true, but it's 20 years. And I started on kind of the selection and assessment side of the business, helping
Okay.
clients make informed hiring decisions that move to kind of team development sessions and all the way up to the work I'm doing today, which
Mhm.
focuses really around equipping teams to, yeah, turn problems into partnerships.
So you've spent 20 years plus your service time in the industry.
Mhm.
Um, what have been some of the key themes and insights that you've arrived at over that time?
Well, I'd say if I look back at when I first started this work versus what I do now, probably a big shift for me is if a client used to ask me to get involved in some kind of conflict between teams or between leaders, I'd sit down and I'd talk to one leader and I'd say to myself, this person's making a lot of sense. Someone needs to go talk to that other knucklehead over there. And that person would be me. So I'd go talk to the other person. And you know what? They would make a lot of sense too. And it used to drive me nuts because, if who's right here? And I've
Mhm.
realized that it's that type of thinking that there is one side that's right or another that really is what fuels the conflict. So for me, I approach those scenarios in a much different way now, basically trying to to look at the whole of the issue and help both parties, whether it's teams or leaders, see the issue holistically. Because
Yeah.
I think when you can see the issue holistically, that's when creative solutions start to present themselves. So that's been a big shift for me, and I find it so helpful in my work with.
So what do you see what do you see as you see work with teams? I mean, I know I've been in corporate America for 30 years and experienced a lot of different perspectives on sort of team function. What do you see teams still struggling with? What do you see sort of corporate America still struggling with?
Well, yeah, great question. I think fundamentally some of the biggest challenges that leadership teams and organizations need to solve for are the types of problems that require changes that cut across functions, right? That it's not something as simple as, okay, sales needs to adjust this or supply chain just needs to get
Mhm.
their act together. Nothing against supply chain. Those are, in some ways, those are the easier problems to solve, but it's when there are challenges that cut across multiple functions and it requires a level of transparency and openness, and we might even say negotiation around finding a solution together. That gets really tricky because the way I think most people approach those scenarios, whether we realize it or not, we approach them in a win and be right kind of way, right? My default position, if I'm in that conversation, is I see all the problems over there, and it's not so easy for me to see the problems on my side. So knowing that, especially in a peer-to-peer senior executive level,
Yeah.
it's really hard to talk to colleagues to maintain trust in a relationship and to tell people they're screwed up. So what often happens is people avoid that conversation altogether, to the detriment of the organization, and I think to the detriment of team culture, because it's going to sound a little odd, but I think there's actually a lot of joy in being able to solve problems together as teams. And when teams aren't talking about that stuff, it robs them of joy. So that's what anytime we're touching on topics that might be embarrassing or threatening to people, that's
Yep.
when teams can struggle.
So still cross-functional. That's one area that you see sort of struggles. Um, you spoke a little bit about these scenarios or these contexts when you talk to one party and they're right, or at least they
Yeah.
think they have a pretty reasonable perspective, and you talk to another party and they have a pretty reasonable perspective, and yet you get into these sort of situations where you're avoiding actually dealing with the issues. Can you give us a sense of what these look like? What should people be thinking about as they think about these kind of situations?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I call them right on right fights. Because if you spend time talking to anyone involved, if you listen to their story, that logic is going to be airtight. There's going to be like five good reasons why they're advocating what they're advocating.
Mhm.
Talk to the other group, there's going to be five or six good reasons, right? So I want you to, see if you can recall a time when maybe you've said yourself or you've heard people in the organization saying in some form or fashion where they're complaining about another team and they're saying, oh, they're just throwing things over the fence, or they're not responding to our requests. They're making another decision in a silo. What's generally speaking, what's going on in situations like that is that one team is working in ways that make it more difficult for another team. So after the first team has had enough, they try to go talk to the other group. They try to give feedback. Maybe they complain a little bit, but they get a lot of yeah buts in response and explanations for why things just can't change. So what happens? So instead, they try to figure out ways to work around the issue, which most of the time means just working around one another. And as a result, the same problems keep bubbling up over and over. And when one team or the other gets tired of this, they escalate the issue to a higher up in hopes that he or she will go fix the other team. And that's what I call a here we go again loop, because it has a here we go again quality. If it happens once, it happens quicker the second time, and so on. And it also puts the leader in the position of having to serve as the referee, right? Intervening, making the decision, calling the penalty, and so on. And that really just doesn't work for anyone involved, neither the two teams or the referee leader over the long run. And I think this here we go again loop is kind of like the common cold in many organizations, especially across functional lines.
I've seen cross-functional groups get in really big jams because they have perceptions about what each of the other groups is doing. Um, what's really going on here? What is really sort of the mechanism at work, or can you help us sort of tease this apart?
Yeah, right. Because no one would design for this. I don't think anyone involved in a situation like this enjoys it very much. Neither the referee leader or the two teams involved. I think the real problem here, the thing that fuels it, is the mistaken belief that solutions are more valuable than problems. We even have a saying for this: don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. Now, there's a lot of sense in that counsel. Don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. We as leaders, you don't want your desk to become a complaint department. People do probably really need to give some thought before they escalate things. So there's some wisdom in it. But if that perspective worked, solutions are more valuable than problems, we wouldn't have these here we go again loops.
Mhm.
Because every here we
Mhm.
go again loop basically is an arm wrestling match over a solution. If you're going to work your way out of it, the two or more parties involved have to get to a place where they recognize that problems are more valuable than solutions. So let
Hmm.
me let me try to illustrate that.
Okay.
So do you want to, there you go. All right. So I want you to
Yeah.
imagine this is a very common example of what a here we go again loop can look like. This can happen between supply chain and sales. Most of you are aware of the tension that can exist between these two functions. And I want you to imagine that supply chain, once again, got a large rush order at the end of the month. It wasn't on the forecast. They don't have the inventory. And this is the third month in a row that it's happened. Now, if I'm supply chain, I'm thinking sales is out of control,
Mhm.
right? And what's the solution to this out of control problem? Well, tell the customer no. Now, supply chain may not quite say it like that, because that's maybe not the most acceptable thing to say, but they're going to advocate for something in that neighborhood, putting up some type of barriers or restrictions to making it happen for very good reasons. Now, the problem that supply chain runs into, I think, is that they view effectiveness as being able to take this piece of code and install it in the mind of sales, right?
Mhm.
I'm just going to take this and persuade or convince sales that this is what we need to do. But when they try to do that, they run into an entirely different experience. So, yeah, sales, they know if they don't take this order, they're going to miss the opportunity. And maybe not only miss the opportunity, but maybe miss out on the relationship. So they say yes. And they try to run that ball through the organization. And what happens? They run into a wall
Mhm.
that the solution on the sales side, just this once, is the problem on the supply chain side, and vice versa, right? This is what fuels that right on right fight, this here we go again loop, because with both parties being right, no one walks away from this. And typically what happens in every here we go again loop is the conversation is happening at the level of solution. Tell the customer no, just this once. That's never going to work as long as there are different versions of the problem in play. And that's what you can see here, right? On the sales side, supply chain is too tight versus sales is out of control. I've come to believe that people cannot be partners if they aren't in the same problem definition. And oftentimes what that means, since it's a right on right fight, is that the problem definition that supports partnership, it's actually bigger than the problem definition that either party brings to the table. So a lot of the work is around working on the problem definition.
So Bob, I've had some of these kinds of conflicts before. How does the leader get involved, or how do people get the leader involved? And what do you see from a leadership standpoint? What are the common sort of modes of operating?
Yeah, yeah, great question, Kendall. Because oftentimes these here we go again loops do end up on the leader's desk. I think there's a couple of common mistakes. Some options that I commonly see are better than others, but each are kind of flawed in their own way. One way leaders end up getting involved, they intervene and seeing the lost time and the heartache of these here we go again loops, they step in and make the decision. And while this can be good in terms of restoring momentum and getting things moving forward, it really creates a problem in terms of, well, the decision is the leader's decision rather than the team's decision. So it potentially undermines not only commitment to it from one or both sides of the loop, but it also, it probably favors one side of the loop or the other, when in truth, in these situations, you really need to be able to solve that and problem at the center to support both sides. Otherwise, I see leaders sometimes asking teams to just build relationships. So yeah, maybe the teams, they set up these meetings and they meet a time or two, but it fizzles out and never really goes anywhere. Another option I see is leaders step in to facilitate the discussion, which is actually the best of these three options. But the challenge it creates is it puts that leader in a position of continually having to be present to solve the issue rather than upskilling the team's ability to do that on their own.
So you get the up and over phenomena, and you end up
That's
with
right.
a sort of power struggle, if you will, or sort of who's got the trump card, who's got the choice to
Right.
move the needle in this direction. But you talked a little earlier, half the problem here is figuring out what the problem is. How do we as leaders end up screwing up the good function, if you will, of that kind of problem solving?
Well, yeah, I think that's that's where the stepping into resolve really can get in the way, because I think if I'm supply chain, I'm coming in with this belief that sales is out of control.
Hmm.
What that really means is that as a supply chain, I care about process discipline, right? Sales is out of control. What I care about is process discipline, and every organization needs process discipline. What does sales care about? Well, supply chain is too tight. They really care about options and flexibility, right? So
Yeah.
on the one side, you have one group advocating for process discipline, another group advocating for options and flexibility. And let's face it, I think organizations, to be successful, you'd actually need both of those things, right? It's not as simple as picking one side and sticking with it. So I think any move to solution before people agree on the problem short circuits this process. And probably the most valuable thing leaders can do if they find problems like this coming their way is help their people to expand their mind to understand why the other side is right before any decisions or solutions are proposed.
So I'll say in a dysfunctional way, the leader, tries to do right by the people that he's representing and amplifies the perceived problem that his people have brought to him. And you're saying part of what should happen here is that there should be some time spent understanding what the problem is or coming to an agreement on exactly what the problem is.
Yes, yes,
How does that look? How does that look?
well, I mean, you used a word I'm fond of. You just said, what does that exactly look like? Um, I've come to believe if we find ourselves in a loop like this, or if you find your team or teams in your organization in loops like this, no no solutioning should be done until people agree on the problem. And how do you start to agree on the problem? Well, let's take the example of supply chain. If I'm the leader of supply chain and maybe my people are struggling with sales and I want to try to keep the solving at a lower level, I would coach my person to try to explain to sales why sales is right. Why is sales concerned about what they're concerned about?
Hmm.
And keep doing it until sales responds with some version of that's exactly right. That's exactly what I'm concerned about. Because
Gotcha.
that exactly is a signal. Remember, we were talking about here we go again loops. It's when two or more people are rolling their eyes, repeating themselves, thinking that other person doesn't get it. We can't do business with people that don't get it. We can't
Yeah.
trust them, we might say. We can trust people that get it. And what's the best way to demonstrate that we get it? Well, we can explain the other side's concerns and pain points, maybe in ways that that are clearer than they can. Um, what that does is it sends a signal that not only do we get it, but they can stop telling us. So it actually creates some opening for a different type of conversation.
Okay.
It stops the back and forth.
And then if I'm if I'm that other leader and I've now gotten to the point where I'm able to articulate the perspective of the other side in a way where they go, that's exactly right. If I still have concerns or issues that haven't been brought into that view, does that come after? How do I think about sort of starting to work that in? Because there has to be an agreement on what the problem is, right? Not just, okay, now I've understood how you see the problem. What happens
Right.
next then?
Yeah. So, right. I want to point out a couple things. Just because I, Kendall, let's say it's you and I, just
Hmm.
because I understand your pain and I've articulated it, and you're like, yep, that's exactly it. It doesn't necessarily mean I agree with it,
Okay.
nor does it necessarily mean I put down my own concerns. I think ultimately this is an addition problem that, if you're on the sales side and you're concerned about options and flexibility, I got to make sure I understand that. Once I demonstrate that I understand that, I actually increase my ability to be influential because you see me as someone who gets it.
Yeah.
You don't have to keep telling me what your pain point is. You can actually go quiet for a moment. That actually creates an opening for me to describe the concerns that I'm seeing. And
Hmm.
since I've I've paid you the respect of understanding and really kind of mastering your side of the argument, right? You've given me the exactly.
Hmm.
And I think that's an act of respect. Since I've paid you that respect, you're more likely to do the same for me,
So there's a
right?
reciprocation piece in it.
There's a reciprocation. There's reciprocation. So
Okay.
ultimately, in this example, um, where we want sales and supply chain to be is to solve for the process discipline and the options and flexibility problem.
Hmm. Hmm.
And what I find is if we can expand that problem definition to one that is holistic, that includes both sides of the argument, um, it actually changes the nature of the relationship. Because Kendall, back to you and I, let's say you're on the sales side. If I'm the supply chain guy, I know what good process discipline looks like. I already have that
Yeah.
answer. But if I've grown into a process discipline and flexibility and options problem, I'm not a flexibility and options expert. I need your help in figuring that out. So
Yeah.
if we get into the same problem definition, it changes our relationship. We're no longer opponents. We're actually allies in trying to figure this out. And then the other part of that is since we've changed the problem definition, we're starting to use the and version of it. Well, solutions are known by the problems they solve. Change the problem definition, it actually creates more room for
For
solutions you would
solutions.
not have. Right. So, as I like to say, all the money or all the creativity is in the problem. It ain't in the solution. The money's in
So
the
in the
problem.
in the process of getting the problems sorted out and making sure there's alignment on the problem, you build space and trust and dialogue to be able to then work on the solutions. You get a better, more
100%.
collaborative or constructive context to work on the solutions. I mean, it's super interesting. It gives leaders a way to start to think about where they may be not helping their teams. Um,
Right.
I want to, I want to, I want to get a little bit into how you work with teams, specifically what the experience is like when you work with a team. And then I want to take this problem up a level to leadership teams. But why don't we take a few minutes and take some questions from the audience?
So excellent connections. I agree with both the
Mhm.
connections you point out. Maybe the only thing I'd add to that is at the center of this approach is a focus on learning. I think in many
Yeah.
organizations, it's real easy to default to win and be right because people really care about stuff and they got deadlines and they got KPIs. So we want to, and there are reputations on the line. So
Mhm.
we know these things, but it's so easy to default to win and be right, which is a right on right fight. So when we're doing these things, seek first to understand, active listening, etc. The emphasis here is I'm not trying to change, if I'm supply chain, I'm not trying to change sales mind. I'll worry about that later. Let me make sure
Mhm.
I'm in the right place first. Because if I can get that right, I call it solving the Bob Johnson problem. If I can solve the Bob Johnson problem, all of a sudden he starts to change too.
I think you drawn some really interesting parallels because there is a therapeutic aspect in this as
Hmm.
well. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, great question. This touches on methodology.
Mhm.
Um, I'll take the question, Kendall, unless you want me to save this for a little bit later.
No, go right ahead. Go right ahead.
So whenever I'm doing this work, I'm typically doing two things. Front and center, I'll talk about one of them right now. It involves a 3-minute videotape role play. Matt, let me ask you this. Anyone on this call ever put their swing on video? Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So what's that like when you're watching yourself perform a sport on video? What's humbling about that? The the real the real versus feel, right? That's what they say in golf. Well,
Mhm.
that gap that exists in sports, it also exists in solving problems like these. Most people think they listen, most people think they're transparent, most people think they collaborate, but the truth of the matter is when stakes are high, we do the opposite and we don't even recognize it. So getting people to start to wrestle with the problem starts with putting them on video and showing them the problem. So it's a 3-minute videotape role play that I do, and we watch it all together in a room full of people. Um, and what people see is that, well, I guess the bad news is that the problem exists. The good news is we all struggle with this stuff, and that if you're going to if you're going to break free of the here we go again loop and get into that 200% version of the problem, you've got to start. The 200% version is 100 plus 100. Well, it means I'm missing half of the equation. That's the Bob Johnson problem. So let me get my adversary to teach me what I may not be seeing, which is incredibly hard to do. But it's the most useful thing in situations like this.
We see something similar when one of the things I know, Bob, is we connected and we started ideating on this roundtable. I saw similarities in the method that you use between sort of what we teach when we teach sales, as well as what we
Yeah.
teach when we teach executives, executive influence, and you see this same phenomenon too with a seller. If they know their pitch really well,
Hmm.
right, and they get into a situation, oftentimes it's very easy to go into pitch mode when what you need to be doing is going into listening mode and understanding if your pitch is ever going to land and not delivering the pitch if it's not going to land, right? There's a lot you can tell by going into listening mode and understanding, does this person even have this problem framed in the same way that I do?
Right. Because if you're pitching a problem different than the problem they have in their mind, then it's just a bunch of hot air.
It never lands. It never
No.
lands.
So the connection here is every here we go again loop is an influence problem because I'm trying to get to buy solutions to the problem I see, but they don't match the problem he sees, so it's a waste of time at best. Um,
So when you're working with teams, Bob, do you teach the teams how to work out their own problems? Do you help the leaders understand how they should guide the teams, sort of beyond sort of the revealing how people are
yeah,
not helping the situation? What's the end state that you're trying to go to?
yeah. I want people to be doing executive level work as deep in the organization as is possible. That means owning the and problem themselves. Typically, then what I'm doing then is working with the engagements I love are
Mhm.
those cross-functional engagements. Maybe it's product management and customer experience, sales, supply chain. It's two sides of the marketing function. I love to get that tension in the room and build the skills through that videotape role play, but then also help them map the problem. Um, Help them. It's an approach I use called polarity management. But it's
Yeah.
basically, okay, how do you map the flexibility and the process discipline problem so you're actually trying to harvest the upside of both and developing actions that that really move the needle. So yeah, I'm doing skill building and facilitated problem solving with the teams and leaders included. But we really want the antagonists and protagonists to be engaging directly.
So your end goal would be the teams have a sense and have the skills to be able to deal with some of these problems on their own rather than escalating them up. So the
Oh
teams
yeah,
are capable of actually solving the problems on their own.
100%. Yeah.
And then the leaders, does their role shift to one of coach, helping figure out how to teach other teams? What is the sort of how do you think about the
Well,
leader's role in that now very idealistic scenario where my
right,
team's not coming to me anymore with problems, right?
right. Well, yeah, that begs the question, well, what's the opposite of a referee leader? I haven't
Hmm.
quite worked out that language, but um, it's getting back to more strategically valuable parts of their work rather than getting bogged down in refereeing situations. Um, they actually free up their time to look forward, right?
That's huge. That's
Yeah,
huge because time spent in sort of managing conflict is time that you can't spend doing anything else. Do you are you do you invest in the leaders the ability to teach groups how to start to do this as well? Is that part of the skills that leaders then need to learn, or do they gain a respect for how to do this by understanding what the problem is and sort of reframing it for themselves? How
Um,
does that work with leaders?
uh, oftentimes it can happen a couple different ways. Sometimes leaders, I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question, so let me try.
That's okay.
Sometimes leaders ask me to work with different teams in the organization and we take the work deeper. That's great. I'm happy to do
Yeah.
that. Other
Yeah.
times, what I see leaders do is they know the skills and they start to coach beyond the initial group. Begin to apply in their own organic way these same skills, and it
Yeah.
works that way too. Um, that's really important to me. I want people at the end of an engagement. I want people to have a durable skill set that they can apply that stays with them, um, whether or not we continue to work together. And that's what I
Yeah.
see oftentimes. Um,
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. The groups you work with, those people now have those skills to be able to do that. Ultimately, the leaders are gonna, they can become leaders in and of themselves, but the leaders are also going to go from group to group. They may have other groups that they lead,
mhm.
and they're going to find other groups in different states of maturity. And if they can actually teach, right, that's part of the role there that I think becomes really compelling, is if they can teach, they can now sort of help alleviate those types of conflicts within groups.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
I have one other question, then I want to go to leadership team. We've got about 10 minutes or so left. There's a certain element of vulnerability when you set aside your agenda and are listening to other people's agenda and trying to make sure that you get it right without knowledge that somebody's going to reciprocate for you. Um, how do you help leaders think about that? Because that's not normally the state of many leaders, right? They're sort of staking out their territory and they need to be assertive about their particular points of view. And now here's a situation where I may be giving up power. Um, how do I think about that sort of state that I have to put myself into that position of vulnerability before I get to a point
Yeah,
where my issues and my needs might be met as well?
right. So, fantastic question. I think at the heart of this approach, this is this is really an exploration of how people use power in organizations. That's
Yeah.
what I think this work is about. And here we go again, loops. Typically, people use power over. That's
Hmm.
why we escalate. That's why we go up and over. Like I'm going to try to use power over, and I know on a peer-to-peer basis that's really hard to do. So I'll try it, but I'm not going to persist too long on it because I know it's not going to work. So I'm going to escalate. So that's power
Hmm.
over.
Hmm.
This is not the opposite of that. It's different. The opposite of that is no power, we might say. This is about power with, using power with people. Um, and it doesn't mean not being assertive.
Hmm.
The shift here is most people think of assertive in closed ways. I have the answer. I know what we're going to do. get on board. I'm caricaturizing it, but
Yep.
that's
Yep.
closed assertive. What we're talking about here is being open and assertive at the same time. What does that mean? It means we have to shift our understanding of where credibility and effectiveness comes from as leaders. It's real easy to define leadership as having answers, knowing things.
Hmm.
And that's fair. I love it. I love knowing stuff. I love having answers. I'm not opposed to that. But let's face it, there are many situations where the answers aren't so clear. And if I'm a leader and I'm defining probably unconsciously that leadership is about having answers, then I've got a problem on my hands. I've got to hide my not knowing and go over here and learn by myself. What we're talking about here is I think, expanding or adding to that definition of leadership as, it is about having answers. That's great. But perhaps more valuably, leadership is about knowing how to get to answers. And this methodology is about using power in that direction. So it does not have the same requirement that my answer carries the day, that I know where we're going before the conversation starts, because my power and authority doesn't come from only having answers. It comes from knowing how to get to answers. So in
Yeah.
that sense, in a conventional sense, it feels like we're giving up power. But I think we're actually accruing power, because when people feel listened to, they see us as getting it. They experience that as a sign of respect, and we earn their trust. And don't we listen to the people we trust?
Yeah.
So our mind wants to tell us power comes from talking. Um, and it does, but it it comes from listening too, in surprising ways.
Yeah. No, I think that's super powerful, and it's so counterintuitive
Mhm.
to conventional leadership wisdom, right? When we coach executives and we talk about their ability to influence, we focus them, the way we think about it is case making is not where the influence is. Making your
Mhm.
case and making the argument is
Exactly.
not where the real influence is in figuring out the frame, we call it, right? And it's
Mhm.
essentially the same thing as figuring out what the problem is, you know? If you can figure out together what the problem is and reveal a blind spot, you've become an asset to your peer, right? And when you become an asset to your peer, you
Mhm.
become influential in that sense. And it's hugely counterintuitive, but it's hugely enabling. I think you've seen the same type of effect
Oh yeah. Yeah.
with the groups
The
that
way
you
out
work
of
with.
these, here we go again, loops, is in. Understand what's happening, what's fueling it before you try to solution your way out of it.
Yeah. So once we get to the executive level, this all goes away, right, Bob?
It 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 shape shifts. Okay, so um, what I find is this: in organizations, uh, between functions, you're usually going to get a hot version of a here we go again loop. And what's a hot
Yeah.
version? Some version of open disagreement.
Hmm.
Um, in Within teams, particularly leadership teams, when I'm talking to senior leaders, CEOs, oftentimes the challenge they're bringing to me is I just can't get the team to talk about our most complicated issues. They bring the thing to me in our one-to-one, you know, saying, okay, I'm
Hmm.
concerned about performance over there. We're not seeing the accountability we need. But when the topic comes up in the team meeting, they act as if everything's fine. Um, it comes from a good place. They don't want to disturb the team dynamic, the team culture. But again, it robs the team of trust. So what ends up happening is you get these cool versions where the conflict goes underground, and certain topics become off limits. And the reason they're off limits is basically people know that if they're really honest, my version of honest is, Kendall, you don't get it. Let me tell you how you need to get it. We know we can't do that with peers, especially peers we need to play nice with in a team. So the issue goes underground, it pops up in one-to-ones, and um, you get kind of this sandbox effect, right? Where everyone's staying in their sandbox,
Yeah.
uh, playing nicely in their area. But as we talked about earlier, a lot of the most complicated challenges organizations face can only be solved through coordinated effort across
Yeah.
functions. So that's the problem there.
Man, I resonate with that. It's almost as if I read between the lines, by the time you hit the executive level, you have enough emotional intelligence to know that hot conflicts are not going to end well.
Hmm.
And there is this collegiality, right? I have my power base, I have my sandbox. I will show you, some deference by not throwing stones into your sandbox, but I kind of expect the same thing in reverse.
Hmm.
Does that leave the that leaves the problem? My sense is that leaves the problems unresolved.
Unresolved.
Anything that's cross sandbox stays
Right.
unresolved.
Until the CEO steps in and makes the decision, which
Right.
is understandable, but it can jeopardize commitment. Um, so really what you need is you need the team talking about this stuff. And oftentimes I find that if they're going to be talking about it, they got to develop the skills to talk about it in ways that are actually constructive, um, rather than destructive.
Yeah. Yeah. I know as we coach executives, and I've had this exact same experience, right? I've been in leadership teams, the highest functioning leadership teams I've been in have had this sort of sandbox collegiality.
Hmm.
Um, and I had a few experiences where you suddenly realize that what you're missing is all the interdependencies, and you're not managing any of the interdependencies. So you end up with this siloed approach, right? Because the leadership teams aren't actually attacking the interdependencies, and the reality is no function wins on their own. And so in a sense, it's its own dysfunction, but it feels very collegial and sort of quiet. Um, and usually there's a frustrated referee at the top of that pyramid going, man, I wish these guys would figure their stuff out.
Right, because the complaints are probably still happening in the one-to-one
Yeah.
with the boss, just not in the meeting.
And is the approach the same? You work the same way with a leadership team that's
Yeah.
got the
Hmm.
same kind of thing?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's raising the yeah. The problem, as I like to say, the problem isn't the problem. The problem is how we deal with the problem. It's
Yeah.
not the business problem that's the issue. It's the way we deal with the business issue. And if we can deal with business issues in open and assertive ways,
Yeah.
not fall into here we go again loops, hot or cold, then the problem actually becomes the way we build trust and improve performance. Like I believe that 100%.
Yeah.
Um, Only if we can talk about it in open and assertive ways.
Yeah. So if I have and last one on this topic, if I've gone through that as an executive myself, I'm dealing with a peer.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
I've gone through this sort of listening and understanding the problem. I've nailed the problem the way they have it. And now I need to assert three or four pieces that the other
Mhm.
executive is missing that I can see that are
Right.
part of the problem.
Yep.
What's that assertive positive mechanism that I have to now take? Because this is the last piece of it, right? I've been congenial, I've
Right.
listened, I've got
Right.
the reflection listening part right. Now I've got to assert sort of the other side of the issue. How do you
Yeah.
think through coaching that?
In a nutshell, you got to talk about problems, not solutions. I know it sounds like I'm
Mhm.
repeating myself. What do I mean?
Yep.
I've watched 1,200 executives on video, this video I talked about. And
Mhm.
one of the one of the number one problems I see is that everyone wants to talk about a solution. And it's the solution they brought into the room with them, right? You can't, so we got to, if we're going to get into a creative space with the problem, we got to stop talking about the solution. Let me just tell you the problem I see. So, what does that mean? How do we know we're talking about a solution in a situation like this? Anytime, Kendall, I'm telling you to change something, I'm talking about a
Mhm.
solution,
Yeah.
right? So let me stop telling you what to change and start telling you what I see.
Yeah.
When this happens, here's the impact it has. And this is what it's going to cause down the road.
Mhm.
Not so stop it, change it. Leave that part for later. Just describe the problem.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. Here's the thing. When we come in with a solution, what that really means, I think, no one would say this. I don't think we even mean it, but I think this is true. If I come into my conversation with you with a solution in mind, it means I don't trust you with my problem because I've done all the thinking about the solution over there, and I'm just here to deliver a message. A real sign of trust is let me share my problem with you before I've made up my mind on what to
Mhm.
do. That's a real sign of trust.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's the bottom line. That's what being that's the assertive side, right?
Yeah.
Sharing the problems, staying away from solutions.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a funny sense of it because, I think of leadership teams as places of co-opetition, right? You're
Hmm.
you're you're nominally trying to cooperate, but at the same time, you're sort of vying for chits and attention. The minute you have to start saying, well, okay, now here are four problems that creates in my space, there can be an approach of, oh, that I'm demonstrating weakness, or I'm demonstrating lack of competence, or I'm unable to handle sort of the things that everybody is throwing at me. And
Hmm.
so there's a reluctance to there is a trust
Right.
aspect, but there's also this reluctance aspect of, okay, if I'm going to share my problem now, or the problem that creates, and now I'm dealing with it in my sandbox. And gosh, I'd rather have my sandbox be nice and swept and clean, and that's the appearance
Right.
I want to project.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It flows from this idea that leadership is about having answers.
Yeah.
Um, and that's great. Answer's good, not bad, but it's not big enough for many of the challenges that organizations face.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I want to open it up again if anybody else has another question. I know we were a little bit over, but if folks have another question, I'm happy to take that now.
So there's an inner game to all this, and it does require people to have the maturity to uh, trust ambiguity enough to stay in it rather than try to
Yeah.
escape it. So how do you do that? I think then if you're going to ask people to tolerate ambiguity, then take the ambiguity out of the process. What does that mean? And I'm shortcutting this, and it's
Yeah.
probably not this easy, but you might say, look, we're going to spend this meeting and the next one fleshing out the problem. What are all the aspects we're seeing? After that,
Hmm.
we're all going to go away, digest what we see, and then we're going the third
Hmm.
meeting, we're going to come back and we're going to start talking about solutions. You know, if
Yeah. Yeah.
you can give people a sense of what's the sequence here, that is more likely to earn their trust versus a more open-ended, unmapped
Yeah.
process.
So, Bob, I've thrown up your white paper, and it will be
Okay,
available in the slides that we send
Oh,
out and the
great.
executive summary as well. And then
Cool.
you're offering as well for any executive that's interested,
oh
45
yeah,
minute
sure.
consultation on sort of the situation they have with their current team,
Awesome.
if they've got concerns or issues. So, and I've got your contact information out. Um, Super great conversation. We got into some places I didn't even expect that we would get into based upon what we had. Bob, I want to thank you as well. Thank you so much, and great
Yeah,
conversation.
Thank you
It's a
both.
great conversation.